to this week's Lecture 7 in the series The Middle East on the Move, Forward or Backward. The aim of our lecture series is to empower the listeners to attempt to ascertain the future direction of the Middle East, and more specifically, whether it is headed toward more intra-regional cooperation and collaboration to create a better, more peaceful region. It is difficult to remain optimistic about the prospects of peaceful and prosperous Middle East at the time that at least 3 or 4 civil wars are playing out in Syria, Yemen, Libya, and potentially Lebanon, not to mention recent developments in Afghanistan and the threat of Iran that could really stabilize the region. Add to the mix the endless Israeli-Palestinian conflict that remains unsettled, and you have reasons to believe, proven through history, that the region is destined to perpetual conflicts like civil or outright wars. In today's lecture, we will focus on the reasons why major conflicts are so indigenous to the region and the grave consequences of it becoming the Middle East destiny. In this lecture, we will drill down to understand why the Middle East is prone to constant conflicts, why most conflicts are ever so protracted, why there are no democracies in the Middle East except in Israel, why populist uprising always fail, why nation building always fails, and why foreign powers are useless. This map refers to Arab uprising and the degrees to which Middle East countries were impacted by it. Uprising, which is more or less synonymous with civil wars. As you can see, except for Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon, and the latter, which was not at the crisis point as it is today when this map was published, are the only one who remain sort of intact. But even Israel and Jordan, who are not designated as impacted on the map, are clearly involved in the longest conflict with the Palestinians. In other words, the whole region is awash with violent conflicts of varying degrees of intensity. This map highlights countries where presently civil wars or civil unrest are playing out. As you can see, conflicts extend even to North Africa. At the same time, the map also illustrates why the countries that are not now impacted by internal or intra-regional conflicts have the incentive to unite in cooperating and collaborating to move their countries and the region forward, as evident by the normalization of relations between the Gulf states, Bahrain and United Arab Emirates, and also Morocco and Sudan with Israel. The reason why civil wars and intra-regional wars are so pervasive in the Middle East has mainly to do with the nature of the regimes, which are predominantly autocratic, ruled by monarchies or military dictatorships. This is also true around the world. History taught us that autocratic regimes sooner or later become oppressive, corrupt, and are not ruling in the best interest of their citizenship, but rather amass power and wealth at the expense of the citizenry. The Arab Spring of 2011 is a perfect illustration of this phenomenon. However, in the Middle East, there are certain attributes that make these conflicts so protracted and almost intractable. In most cases, the regime manages to suppress uprising or at least to maintain power even in the face of fierce opposition, as for example in Syria. More often than not, these regimes fall only when foreign powers intervene militarily, as has been the case in Saddam Hussein's Iraq in 2003 and later on Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. So why is that most conflicts are so protracted and some irretractable? First, because autocratic regimes have created a machinery of coercion, either through the military or security apparatuses that are ready to shoot to kill their own civilians at the direction of the regime, as we witnessed in Syria and more recently in Kazakhstan. Second, in most civil wars, the opposition is fragmented and divided, again as illustrated in the next chart. This is a function of the incessant tribalism that characterizes the region. And third, the intervention of foreign powers such as the United States in Iraq or Russia and Syria, who have less regard for the population than to their own strategic interests in the region. The Syrian civil war is a perfect example of a fragmented, divided opposition. There are 41 factions who combined to form the rebels who are trying to bring down the Assad regime in Syria. 8 of the 41 factions have fighters from eastern Syria, 4 factions have fighters from southern Syria, and all factions have fighters from northern Syria. But it's important to understand that in each of those regions there are different tribes, ethnicities, who themselves have had conflicts among themselves and are trying to unite in opposition to the regime. It is almost redundant to explain the impact that conflicts have on the Middle East. Of course, they destabilize the region. More importantly, they kill non-combatants, hundreds of thousands of innocent men, women, and children. But beyond that, they may do so much damage to the prospects of the country recovering from the conflicts. It slows or halt or reverse any progress that has been made. It destroys the economy. It destroys infrastructure. It creates massive amounts, millions of refugees. It invites extremist non-state actors, as we've seen ISIS come into Iraq and Syria. And it not only affects the country in which there is conflict, but it affects other nations, neighboring nations, because refugees flee to those nations, as Syrian refugees in millions went to Turkey, Jordan, and even Iraq. We'll now begin our review and analysis of the major Middle East conflicts that could set the Middle East in a backwards direction. Let's start with a reminder of the overview from the second lecture and proceed with a deep dive into both. No study of the Middle East to gain a better understanding of the regional dynamics can be complete without the acknowledgement of two peoples who lost out during the division of the Middle East into sovereign states and remain politically homeless. They are the Kurds and the Palestinians, both for different reasons. In future lectures, we will review the plight of the Kurds and the Palestinians in great detail. Suffice it to say that the Kurds, in the initial division of the Middle East between the French and the British, were initially awarded the state of Kurdistan. And only after the British discovery of major oil reserves near Kirkuk in the Kurdish territory, the British decided to amalgamate the Kurds region with Iraq and left the Kurdish population, now estimated between 30 and 40 million, scattered across 5 countries: Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Armenia. The Kurds and the Palestinians aspire statehood that has been denied to them. The Palestinians, who number close to 10 million, are scattered across Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Jordan, the Gaza Strip, Lebanon, and Egypt, not to mention the diaspora. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the most entrenched of the two, has been the cause for many wars, terrorist attacks, and intifadas, meaning revolts, which we will review in future lectures. The conflict of all conflicts in the Middle East is the almost 75 years old Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Interestingly, and despite some recent scrimmages between Hamas in the Gaza Strip and the Israeli Defense Forces, it is the least violent of all present conflicts at this time. Yet it has been, and to a large degree continues to be, the major obstacle to achieve true peace in the Middle East. Most of you listeners must have heard all the narratives surrounding this conflict. That of the Palestinians, that of the Israelis, with variations between the right and the left, the many attempts at negotiated peace agreements resulting in the establishment of a Palestinian state side by side with Israel failed over the years. We will attempt to separate the politicized interpretation of the many stakeholders in this conflict, and likely would not address within the limited time we have all of them. Nevertheless, we will start with some foundational information about the nature and origins of the conflict, as you will learn by watching the next two videos.
The conflict between Israel and Palestine has raged on for generations. The fighting we see in 2021 is over the same issues and hatred born of 100 years of struggle. So, how did it start? Well, after the Ottoman Empire was defeated in World War I, Britain took control of the area known as Palestine, a strip of land between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. Back then, it was occupied by an Arab majority and a Jewish minority. The international community tasked Britain with setting up a, quote, national home for Jewish people in Palestine. But both the Jews and Arabs claimed that historical Palestine was their land. You can see how that will become an issue. From the 20s to the 40s, many Jewish people fled to Palestine to escape persecution and the atrocities of the Holocaust. But that only incited the Arab population living there. Violence between the Jews, Arabs and against the Brits escalated. So, in 1947, the United Nations voted for Palestine to be split into separate Jewish and Arab states. Jerusalem, a holy land for both, would become an international city. Jewish leaders embraced the plan, but the Arab leaders did not. So began a stalemate. In 1948, the Brits realised the problem couldn't be solved by them, so they left. And Jewish leaders declared the creation of the State of Israel, with the backing of then US President Harry Truman. This did not go down well with many Palestinians. A war broke out, with neighbouring Arab countries, including Jordan and Egypt, joining the fight, the beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It was catastrophic for Palestinians. Hundreds of thousands fled. By the time fighting ended the following year, Israel controlled most of the land. Jordan, siding with the Palestinians, occupied land which became known as the West Bank, while Egypt occupied Gaza. Jerusalem was divided between Israeli forces in the west and Jordanian forces in the east. Crucially, there was never a peace agreement. Each side blamed the other. War would continue for decades. Fast forward to June 5, 1967, the beginning of the Six-Day War. Now, this is significant because the map was again redrawn. Israel captured and occupied the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and other Arab territories. The thing is, most Palestinian refugees and their descendants live in Gaza and the West Bank. Neither they nor their descendants have been allowed by Israel to return to their homes. Israel says this would overwhelm the country and threaten its existence as a Jewish state. Now, Israel still occupies the West Bank, and even though it pulled out of Gaza, the UN still recognises that land as occupied territory. Following? Okay, now let's look at Jerusalem. It's one of the holiest lands on earth for Christians, Jews and Muslims. Israel claims the whole city as its capital, but Palestine claims East Jerusalem is the capital of its future state. For the past 50 years, Israel has built settlements in Jerusalem. More than 600,000 Jews now live there, but the Palestinians say that's illegal under international law. There have been numerous attempts at peace over the decades, starting in 1979 and culminating in the 90s in Oslo. Palestinian and Israeli leaders met and negotiated a two-state solution. Initial promise and optimism gave way to anger and distrust, and by 2000, violence again erupted. By 2008, the prospects of peace had taken a severe hit. The most recent peace plan came from Donald Trump in January 2020. Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu said it was, quote, deal of the century, but the Palestinians scoffed at it, saying it was one-sided. So, tensions remained incredibly high, particularly in East Jerusalem, Gaza and the West Bank. Since 2007, Gaza has been ruled by a Palestinian militant group called Hamas, which has battled Israel countless times. Palestinians say they're suffering because of Israeli actions and restrictions. Israel says it's only acting to protect itself from Palestinian violence. It is endless. But things really kicked off in mid-April 2021, the start of the holy Muslim month of Ramadan. There were daily, violent clashes between Israeli police and Palestinians, and scenes like this. Forced eviction of Palestinian families in East Jerusalem, which inflamed the situation. In the neighbourhood of Sheikh Jarrah, an Israeli man with a thick New York accent is filmed occupying the backyard of a Palestinian woman's home.
Jacob, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
But
It's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, يا عمي.
And then this. Israel unleashed devastating airstrikes on Gaza, while Hamas countered with hundreds of rockets fired back at Israel. As has so often been the case, conflicting claims over Jerusalem is at the emotional core of this conflict. Egypt and other surrounding nations tried to broker peace, but as always, for peace to be agreed, both sides need to resolve complex, deep-seated issues. And until that happens, it's hard to see an end to this endless conflict.
May 14, 1948, the British mandate in Palestine is about to expire. David Ben-Gurion proclaims the birth of the State of Israel. The next day, the 5 neighboring Arab countries declare war.
The city of Haifa and its harbor become the center of bitter conflict as the new Jewish state is born in the tense atmosphere of civil war.
During the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, more than 700,000 Palestinians are forced into exile. It's the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic.
Haganah forces seek out every Arab, and barricades are set up to screen those who had not already fled the city. Everyone is searched.
The Haganah, a paramilitary organization, forms the core of Israeli forces and is responsible for expelling Palestinians. Some leave on their own to escape the violence. Their lands and houses are seized. Most flee to Gaza, Jordan, Lebanon, or Syria. On December 11, 1948, the United Nations adopts a resolution for the right of return for these Palestinian refugees, but Israel has never given its permission. 70 years later, Ibrahim Mahmoud still lives in the Jalazon camp north of Ramallah. He was 17 when he had to leave his native village, which is now in Israeli territory.
We went to the mountains and we spent 4 or 5 nights there. People were lost like sheep without a shepherd. I promise before God that we will go home. We have to go home.
Every May 14th, the Israelis celebrate the creation of their state, while the following day, Palestinian refugees and their children commemorate the Nakba. They've never abandoned their hope of returning to their village.
One day, we'll come back to our land
and we'll have rights again. We'll continue to resist until we get it all back.
This Palestinian family holds on tightly to that precious symbol of their right to return, the key to the house they were forced to abandon 70 years ago.
In the next chart, you will see what is referred to as the thorny issues that need to be resolved in order to end the conflict, with the result being peace between Israel and a newly formed Palestinian state by its side. Since the end of the 6 Days War, for 55 years now, there have been endless unsuccessful negotiations, even wars, to arrive or force a resolution of the conflict. We will review a shorthand version of the main attempts for resolving the conflict, but beforehand, let us review the nature of the thorny issues and their possible resolutions. You will also notice that there is a number attached to each of the issues. This number is entirely my personal subjective evaluation of the degree of difficulty to resolve the issue on a scale of 1 to 10. I offer it based on my knowledge of the outcome of many negotiation cycles that have taken place over the years. First, a disclaimer. The following analysis is my personal interpretation of the issues and their possible resolutions. Some of you may disagree or offer alternative solutions, and I invite you to send them to me as part of the Q&A. So let's begin. Borders. There will not be a return to the 1967 borders no matter what UN resolutions are cited. The reality is that towns and cities known as the settlements will not be dismantled. Borders are a serious issue, as if a Palestinian state is to be established in the West Bank and Gaza, it can no longer be contiguous, and there is not sufficient landmass to resettle the refugees from the UNRWA camps in the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza. Therefore, a border solution requires land swaps between Israel, Jordan, or maybe even Saudi Arabia. Settlements. With the exception of small or illegal settlements in territory that would clearly be part of a Palestinian state, the settlement block is here to stay. Right of return. There will not and cannot be a right of return of pre-1948 Palestinians or their heirs to towns and villages from which they fled or expelled 75 years ago. The reality makes it a non-starter. At best, there could be some family unification with Palestinian families who chose to remain in Israel post-1948 and are now Israeli citizens. Jerusalem. Israel in the past offered to allow East Jerusalem Palestinian neighborhoods to become the capital of a Palestinian state. Mutual recognition goes without saying as a condition precedent to any agreement. While the Palestinian Authority agreed to recognize Israel, the Hamas that rules the Gaza Strip vowed to never do so. Refugees. Refugees must be resettled outside the refugee camps in towns and villages that may have to be built as part of the new Palestinian state. There must be an end to United Nations economic patronship over the refugees in the camps, which may require compensation to the state, Palestinian state, or directly to its new citizens. Keep in mind that Palestinian refugees in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon are entitled and probably will want to have a right of return to a Palestinian state, seeing that the host countries refuse to accept them as citizens. Security. This is likely the hardest nut to crack. A Palestinian state must be demilitarized, and for maybe a transitional period, Israel Defense Forces or international forces must be deployed on the west bank of the Jordan River to ensure that a new Palestinian state will not harbor a terrorist organization or foreign militias from Syria or Iran. So there you have it. So why hasn't the conflict been resolved many years ago? Let's wind down the clock to 1992 and what is known as the Oslo Accords. It was the first breakthrough in the stalemate that created the Palestinian Authority that had complete civil administration over the West Bank and Gaza. It was intended to be for a transitional period leading up to a full sovereignty. Nobel Prizes were handed, but it all collapsed with the assassination of the then Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin. It led to the rise of a right-wing nationalist government which opposed the Oslo Accord. Attempts were made later under the sponsorship of US presidents, including Bill Clinton in 2000. Each side blamed the other for absence of leadership courage and mutual distrust. There was a lack of consensus in Israel as to the vision of peace and a lack of unity and plenty of hostility between the two Palestinian factions in Gaza and the West Bank. It would seem that the old entrenched guard may have to give way for a younger, more courageous generation of leaders to end the conflict. In 2009, then the Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, who was running for election, made the most bold and generous offer to the still President of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. On the map, you can see that a viable territory for a Palestinian state was offered, which included land swaps from Israeli territory, including a corridor extending through Israel to connect the Gaza Strip to the West Bank, and in total close to 100% of the territory populated by Palestinians before the 1967 war. Abbas turned it down, some say for fear of losing the election in Gaza to Hamas, which eventually he did anyway, and create an irreconcilable rift between the two Palestinian factions.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is perhaps the most complex political issue of our time. Many have resorted to simply blaming one side or the other. But if we take the time to understand the history and correct our misconceptions, a potential path forward for the Palestinians begins to emerge. So let's start by trying to get the story straight and clear up 10 of the biggest misconceptions out there. Misconception number 1. Israel illegally stole land from the Palestinians. In 1947, the UN voted to give land to both the Jews and the Palestinians. The Jews accepted their partition and legally formed the State of Israel. The Palestinians rejected their partition and attacked. Even after losing the war, the Arabs still had most of the land from the UN ruling. Which leads us to misconception number 2. The surrounding Arab nations actually want to create a Palestinian state. So after the war, the West Bank and Gaza were controlled by Jordan and Egypt for 19 years. During that span, those governments never established a Palestinian state. Instead, they kept the land for their own use. Misconception number 3. The Arab nations want to solve the refugee crisis. Palestinians have settled in Arab nations throughout the Middle East. These nations could solve the crisis immediately by granting refugees equal rights, but instead, they refuse to let them vote, own land, or even study in public schools. Ironically, the only country to grant them full citizenship rights is Israel, which absorbed 156,000 Arabs after the 1948 war, and even today, Arabs hold seats in the Israeli government and Supreme Court. Misconception number 4. UN efforts are helping to solve the refugee crisis. The UN did step in to provide assistance to the Palestinian refugees, but instead of using their existing agency that helps resettle refugee populations around the world, the UN created UNRWA. which labels every Palestinian as a refugee until a Palestinian state is formed within the borders of Israel. This makes it more difficult for Palestinians to thrive in their host countries and locks them into perpetual refugee status, passing it on to their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, swelling the refugee population from 500,000 in 1949 to nearly 5 million today. As conditions worsened, the international aid started to pour in, which, incidentally, is misconception number 5. The solution is more money. Really? Western nations have given the Palestinians a ton of aid. Even taking inflation into account, they've been given 25 times more money per person than Europe was given to rebuild after World War II. Where's the stable economy? Where's the improved infrastructure? That money sure could have helped, but it was given to some leaders who had a different agenda, which brings us headlong into misconception number 6. Forming a state is the primary goal of top Palestinian leaders. All of this international aid did go to help ease one man's suffering, Yasser Arafat. After his death, accountants hired by Arafat's own family discovered secret investments worth more than $1 billion. That income stream would be threatened if a new state was formed, which gives leaders like Arafat, or Mahmoud Abbas for that matter, $1 billion+ reasons to never actually sign a peace treaty. Which leads us to misconception number 7. Israel has a true peace partner. In the year 2000, desperate for a resolution, the Israelis elected Prime Minister Ehud Barak with a mandate to make peace with the Palestinians. Barak offered Yasser Arafat 94% of the land he demanded, except Jerusalem. Arafat flatly refused. President Clinton blamed the failure of the best chance at peace in 60 years squarely on Yasser Arafat. Which brings up perhaps the most common misconception of all. Number 8. Israel just needs to give up land for peace. The last time Israel tried this was in 2005. They forced thousands of Jewish settlers out of Gaza, and in exchange, the Palestinian leaders promised peace. But when the Israelis moved out, the Palestinians voted Hamas in. Yep, they elected a terrorist organization who, since taking power, has fired more than 10,000 rockets into Israel. Surprised? Then you've probably bought into misconception number 9. Most Palestinians want a lasting peace with Israel. Some Palestinians do, but they are a minority. For 60 years, Palestinian educational leaders have fed their children a steady diet of hate, idolizing suicide bombers and celebrating death right in the classroom. And finally, misconception number 10. Giving the Palestinians a state now is the only solution to their suffering. This has been the only approach tried for the last 60 years. But these are people we're talking about. And waiting until they have a state to give them equal rights has only made things worse. Currently, Israel is the only nation to grant full rights to the Palestinians within their borders. But by granting them equal rights in every nation where they live, we could immediately increase the quality of life for every Palestinian. Let's be honest, these misconceptions have concealed potential solutions. When we take time to clear up confusion and face reality, we begin to uncover the truth. And that's when real progress towards justice can begin.
Fast forward to 2020 and the deal of the century, masterminded by the Donald Trump administration and headed by his son-in-law Jared Kushner, was promoted as the deal of all deals, a deal that will provide for a demilitarized Palestinian state living peacefully alongside Israel, with Israel retaining security responsibility west of the Jordan River. That over time the Palestinians will work with the United States and Israel to assume more security responsibility as Israel reduces its security footprint. Neither Palestinians nor Israelis will be uprooted from their homes. Israel has agreed to a 4-year land freeze to secure the possibility of a 2-state solution. Jerusalem will stay united and remain the capital of Israel, while the capital of the state of Palestine will be Al-Quds and include areas of East Jerusalem. Palestinian refugees will be given a choice to live within the future state of Palestine, integrate into the countries where they currently live, or resettle in a third country. There were only a few issues with this wonder plan, mostly attributed to the Trump administration ignorance of Middle East culture and traditions, and in the classic hubris American swagger. The negotiation for the deal of the century did not include the Palestinians, who were never consulted, number one. Number two, the territory carved out for a Palestinian state, as your eyes can see, looked like a Swiss cheese. It was not contiguous and intertwined with Israeli settlement roads and infrastructure. Pride is priceless in the Middle East, and the deal was dead on arrival. So the question is there a viable solution to create a Palestinian state side by side Israel to live in peace and harmony? While the Palestinian and even the new government of Israel are content to kick the peace ball down the street for another time, many pundits and younger leaders from both people are tossing around some out-of-the-box solutions. Here is one about forming an Israeli-Palestinian union with not one, not two, not three, but 4 states: Gaza, the West Bank, the settlements in Judea and Samaria, and Israel proper. Others, and you can see in the next chart, are thinking of unionizing the Palestinian with Jordan, where they were pre-1967, except that Jordan wants nothing to do with it, logical as it may sound. In prior lectures, I have already advocated and described how a Middle East Union, modeled after the European Union, is the most, if not the only viable solution for peace and prosperity in the Middle East. A union of the Sunni Arab states of Egypt, Jordan, Israel, the Palestinian, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states, the beginning of which may have already started with the normalization between the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Israel. However, it will also require, and it will take time, it will require leadership, courage, and may be accelerated by common threats like climate change, water scarcity, and need for alternative energy sources that will motivate the parties to join together.
The Kurdish people are an indigenous group who have lived and moved through the mountains of the Middle East for centuries. Kurds still occupy a sprawling region known as Kurdistan that, on a modern map, spans Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Iran, and a bit of Armenia. As a whole, they're a stateless people, numbering between 20 and 40 million, who've seen the world change around them while they try to maintain their identity. The Kurds are mostly Sunni Muslim, who share a common language, customs, and cultural traditions. But thanks to global powers largely outside their control, they don't share a nationality. For most of recorded history, Kurds have been ruled by conquerors, control of their land just being transferred through diplomacy and war. In the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, took over the region, and they held on to it until the end of World War I. The Washington Post explains, the 1920 Treaty of Sèvres, which created the modern states of Iraq, Syria, and Kuwait, was to have included the possibility of a Kurdish state in the region. That never happened. 1923, a brand new treaty was signed, including with Turkey, and all the countries overlapping with Kurdistan decided it wouldn't be recognized anymore. Rebellions over the years and demands for independence led to even greater hostilities where the Kurds live. The Post explains, the Kurds received especially harsh treatment at the hands of the Turkish government, which tried to deprive them of Kurdish identity by designating them Mountain Turks, outlawing their language and forbidding them to wear traditional Kurdish costumes in the cities. In Iraq, Kurds have faced similar repression. After the Kurds supported Iran in the 1980 to 88 Iran-Iraq War, Saddam Hussein retaliated, razing villages and attacking peasants with chemical weapons. While much of the physical fights for Kurdish independence have dissipated in recent decades, experts say the legislative battle for sovereignty is just beginning.
The Kurds in both Syria and Iraq are fighting, peacefully mind you, for independence. More than 90% of the 3.3 million Kurds in Iraq voted for secession. In Syria, the Kurds who were fighting on the side of the rebels in the civil war declared the creation of an autonomous administration zone in northern Syria. This fight may continue. From all the countries in the Middle East, maybe with the exception of Yemen, Lebanon is the closest to a total economic, social, and political collapse. This is a picture of the Beirut port after the explosion of last year. It does not begin to tell the story of the destruction, loss of life, and political and economic crisis that ensued. From a security point of view, there is a risk that a collapse of state institutions in Lebanon may result in Hezbollah, an Iranian-backed Shia militia, and some say a terrorist organization, will take control of Lebanon and use it as a staging platform against Israel, amongst other things.
Lebanon's financial stability in the 1950s and 60s earned it the title of the Switzerland of the East, and its capital city, Beirut, was previously a magnet for so much tourism that it was known as the Paris of the Middle East. But this is Lebanon today, a victim of one of the worst financial collapses since the 1800s. Life is a daily struggle. Food, fuel, and medicine are unaffordable, and over half the country is below the poverty line.
اللي وجع لي قلبي اكثر شيء الناس الكبار اللي اكبر من العمر ضيق قاعدين عم بيوقفوا بالطرمبة بنزين، هذا اللي معه ضغط وهذا اللي معه السكري وهذا اللي بعد شوي حيقشط ما بعرف شو صاير معه وما حدا عم بيأمن لهم، قيمك من الدواء وقيمك من البنزين والخبار كثير عم بيصير، ما حدا عم بيطلع فينا بعين الرأفة، لا بالعكس مرور الكرام.
After Lebanon's civil war ended in 1990, Lebanon rebuilt through tourism, foreign aid, and large donations from Gulf Arab states. Another major source of income for the country was in the form of remittances from the millions of Lebanese in the diaspora who sent money back home from across the world. But political instability across the Middle East and the Arab world in the past decade has had a major effect in decreasing these remittances, and consistent financial mismanagement by the ruling elite dragged the country deeper and deeper into debt. Sunni Gulf states also began to hold back on their funding as Iran appeared to exert greater influence across Lebanon via Hezbollah. By 2018, the government's failure to deliver political and economic reforms meant a huge amount of foreign aid and investment was being withheld from abroad. Finally, in 2019, mass protests erupted, driven by a generation of youth disenchanted by a political elite that had failed them time and time again. Then came the fateful 2020 explosion at the port of Beirut, followed by the pandemic. For a country already on track for a financial disaster, the explosion in Beirut and COVID-19 were the final nails in the coffin. Lebanon's economic collapse has been ranked amongst the world's worst since the 1800s by the World Bank. Since 2019, the Lebanese pound has lost more than 90% of its value.
أنا كنت صغير فجأة لقيت وقعت على الدنيا ولقيت كل شيء فقر وغلا ودولار، يعني إذا بدك تروح على مدينة المالية ما فيك، إذا بدك تروح على البحر ما فيك. بتدلك بالشغل من الصبح للعشية، بتخلص شغل وبتروح بتنام.
Lebanon's minimum wage has not changed, but hyperinflation as a result of the Lebanese pound crashing has pushed food prices up by 400%.
معي باكل معي ما باكل، ومفتحي بالرودي إذا بتلاقي فيه وقية جبنة أو وقية لبنة أو وقية لحمة أو فروج دجاج أو فخذ دجاج أو فيه.
Drugs and medicines subsidized by the government are running out. There are massive electricity shortages, and even those relying on private generators don't have enough fuel to run them. There are massive queues for fuel, and many are surviving on a few hours of electricity a day.
We talk about hundreds of thousands of businesses and jobs that have been lost. We talk mainly about small and medium businesses run by private entrepreneurs, and we talk about a lot of middle class that has been affected quite badly from the situation.
A recent report from the World Bank estimates that the Lebanese economy will shrink by a massive 10% this year, with the country's GDP dropping exponentially. The report also states that a catastrophic economic collapse such as this usually happens as a result of war, and the crisis has wider-ranging effects.
The crisis affects everyone in Lebanon, not just the Lebanese. As you know, Lebanon hosts the highest number of refugees per capita of residents in the world, with over 1 million Syrian refugees and more than 270,000 Palestinian refugees.
Shortly after the anniversary of the Port of Beirut blast, US President Joe Biden announced a pledge of $100 million in aid for Lebanon.
Today I'm announcing nearly $100 million in new humanitarian assistance. That's on top of the $560 million in humanitarian aid that the United States has provided in Lebanon over the last 2 years. And I urge my fellow leaders in capitals around the world to also step up their support for the Lebanese people.
But as with all foreign aid, it comes with a strict warning for Lebanon's political elite.
No amount of outside assistance will ever be enough if Lebanon's own leaders do not commit to do the hard but necessary work of reforming the economy and combating corruption. It's essential.
We're now shifting our attention to the Syrian civil war. The person you see in this picture was 14 years old when he and a bunch of his friends in 2011, as the Arab Spring erupted across the Middle East, painted graffiti on a wall in Damascus saying something like, "You are next, Bashar al-Assad." This was a match that ignited the Syrian civil war. He and his friends are referred to as the Graffiti Boys. Listen to his story.
My name is Samer Siazna and I'm 21 years old. I was 14 when the revolutions in the Arab world started. We used to follow the news on TV. One day, some friends and I wrote on a wall, "It's your turn, Dr. Assad." Security agencies threatened my father with the arrest of all members of our family if I wasn't handed over to the police within 24 hours. They also told him if he did hand me in, nothing would happen except to sign a pledge not to write words like that again. Instead, myself and 20 of my friends spent 3 months in prison. We suffered all forms of torture and had nightmares. Our families did everything for us to be released. When we were eventually returned to our families, other people welcomed our release near the Al-Omani Mosque by protesting and chanting against the regime. After that, I joined the Free Syrian Army. I fought in battles and I've been injured. I got married and have 2 daughters. I live a normal life, but this will always be my way, either to be a martyr or to achieve victory. But we will never retreat.
So the Syrian civil war, I think, is a latecomer to the reality that there was a revolution. There was a revolution started in the southern part of Syria to criticize the government for police brutality that was happening. And the government decided to, watching what was happening across the Arab world, where we're seeing many governments fall, really put its foot down. And it put it down in such a violent way that it was extremely repressive. And so it started off with a government led by Bashar al-Assad, who basically started to repress its people heavy-handedly. And ultimately, a year later, this became a fight between those who wanted to preserve the regime, preserve the government, keep it in power, because they saw what was happening in other countries and thought, oh, we don't want to become like countries like Egypt or Libya, where there was a lot of turmoil. But those who had been now brutalized by the regime saw no way out, that they had to continue fighting because they didn't want to go back to a situation where the regime continued to kill its people indiscriminately. And to make a long story short, we now have 250,000 people killed, many of which have been killed by the government. Unfortunately, the government has killed people in a very indiscriminate way. In other words, if there are rebels, people who are fighting the regime in a city block, they'll take down the entire building. And that actually is a policy that has created even more hatred toward the government. So, you know, violence breeds violence, and it just continues to spiral. And now we have a protracted civil war whereby there's no solution in sight. The rebels and the opposition absolutely want to get rid of a regime that has so much blood on its hands. And at the same time, the regime has pointed out to the reality, which is true, that there is no rebel movement that's ready to take over power. And so we're at a situation now where there is no real easy way out. And society is very divided about going back to the regime to bring back a semblance of stability to those who vehemently want to see the regime go because it has to be held accountable for so much death and destruction. And that's where we are today. And I think it's a really, sad indication of why it's so difficult to really solve Syria.
We've spoken before about the fact that in most uprisings or civil wars, the regime has the upper hand because it controls the coercive power to overcome the resistance. But also, and none more so than in Syria, the fragmentation of the opposition forces and the intervention of foreign powers has been the main challenge to resolve such conflicts. In the next series of slides, you will see 7 different self-declared stakeholders in the civil war on both sides of the equation. You don't need to read the fine print just to get a feel and understand why, with so many entities with diverse strategic interests, is the final outcome so much in doubt and that this civil war may never end. The civil war is more or less dormant at this time, but it is not over. In fact, Syria is now divided with various entities controlling different regions of the country. But the regime is basically still in control. That said, the death toll and destruction and the humanitarian crisis where more than half of Syrian people were displaced and or fled to neighboring countries, mainly Turkey, cannot be ignored or forgotten. In the next chart, you will see the death toll and the refugee crisis that resulted in the now more than 10 years civil war in Syria. And now Yemen, where the civil war is still raging and is considered to be the most devastating humanitarian crisis ever in the Middle East. It is again a battlefield between 2 foreign powers, Iran and Saudi Arabia, at the expense of the Yemeni people.
Yemen is in the throes of the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The poorest Arab nation was already in dire straits, but a civil war that erupted in 2014 has made the situation even more grim. Now, international support to end the conflict is growing. That's because ordinary Yemenis desperately need help, caught in a conflict that has become a proxy war between regional powers Saudi Arabia and Iran. Also increasing pressure is the killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, a hit that US intelligence believes was orchestrated by the Saudis. The killing shined a light on the US role in the war and its support for Saudi Arabia, which is leading a coalition battling Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. The task of bringing the war to a close will be filled with challenges. To understand them, it helps to look at Yemen's tangle of sectarian fault lines, its history of civil war, and the motivations of regional and world powers. Yemen sits at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, overlooking the vital shipping lanes of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The nation's history has been marked by colonization and dynastic rule. For decades, it was split between 2 nations, North and South. During the 1960s, war erupted. Spasms of civil war continued. By 1990, the North took over the South, forming a unified Yemen. Yemen's longtime autocratic ruler, President Ali Abdullah Saleh, once described the challenge of navigating Yemen's complicated tribal politics as dancing on the heads of snakes. Saleh was perhaps the trickiest player of all, manipulating allies and enemies alike. For years, he took billions of dollars from the US to fight al-Qaeda, even as he enlisted the militants to fight his own domestic enemies. He was ousted in 2011 after a pro-democracy Arab Spring uprising, but the democracy that Yemenis had hoped for didn't materialize. The The latest civil war began in 2014 when Saleh allied with the Houthis, and together they took over the capital Sana'a and much of the north and west. President Abd Rabbo Mansour Hadi fled to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia formed a coalition of Arab and Gulf states to push back the Houthis, who they believed were backed by Iran. The US and European countries have sold billions of dollars worth of weapons to the coalition. The Houthis, inspired by Iran's revolution, are fiercely anti-American and anti-Western, portraying themselves as defenders of Yemeni's Zaidi Shiite minority. Iran denies supplying the rebels, but the US says it has evidence. Complicating the picture are militants, mainly Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, once called the terrorist organization's most dangerous branch. The US has long sought to strike at militant groups in Yemen, and its use of drones has dramatically grown in recent years. After the Khashoggi killing, the US has cut back on its logistical support to the Saudi coalition. The ensuing war has been devastating, with estimates of more than 60,000 people killed, millions driven from their homes, and vast destruction to the infrastructure from coalition bombing. It has also pushed Yemen into near famine, with millions at risk of starving to death. The AP's reporting over the past year uncovered new dimensions to the tragedy. Mothers and fathers are giving up food so they can dedicate what little they do have to keeping their starving children alive. Coalition member United Arab Emirates has set up a network of secret prisons all around the south where torture is rampant, including sexual abuse. After AP's reporting, dozens of prisoners were released. Torture is also rife in the prisons of the Houthi rebels, who have jailed thousands in crackdowns aimed at eliminating any dissent, or just aimed at collecting captives that they can use to trade for ransom or their own captured fighters. As the UN and the international community push for an end to the conflict, it remains to be seen whether a peaceful, unified Yemen is possible. Houthis don't want to return to how it was before the latest war, and the country is more fragmented than ever. Coalition-backed militias that control parts of the south don't necessarily support Hadi. Some in the south want to secede. Militants feel emboldened. Even if the war ends soon, Yemen will struggle with its legacy for years to come.
Over to Libya, where the UN-recognized government in Tripoli is challenged in an outright assault by rebel forces out of Benghazi headed by Khalifa Haftar, a former general who helped Muammar Gaddafi, the infamous Muammar Gaddafi, to seize power in the 1969 revolt. Once again, foreign powers like Turkey, Egypt, and Russia are intervening on both sides to complicate the issue in order to advance their own interest, mainly the Libyan oil.
The bullet holes and destruction are testament to the ferocity of a tribal battle. The city of Zawiya in western Libya saw heavy fighting following the revolution that overthrew Libya's long-time ruler, Muammar Gaddafi, 9 years ago. The fighting was between pro- and anti-Gaddafi tribes. Since then, inter-tribal dialogue has brought agreement and relative calm.
They sat down and made concessions on issues that may have fueled that conflict. That's the main reason why we survived.
But tribal loyalties are being tested again as the civil war shows no sign of ending. Some areas close to Zawiya are heavily populated by tribes loyal to Khalifa Haftar. The warlord launched a military campaign to seize power from the UN-backed government in Tripoli in April. His forces control around 70% of the country. There's often heavy fighting in the southern neighbourhoods of the capital. Haftar's forces shell the only operational international airport in Tripoli virtually every day. To the west, in Zawara, a port town inhabited by mainly Berber tribes on the Tunisia border, leaders say Haftar is trying to galvanise support among Arab tribes, and his fighters have been seen trying to surround the area.
In the last couple of days, we have noticed suspicious activities in military reinforcement on the outskirts. After surveillance in the city, there has been a general mobilization of security forces, and resources have been allocated to counter an offensive.
In January, pro-Haftar tribes forced the closure of Libya's main oil infrastructure in eastern Libya, depriving the UN-backed government of billions of dollars in revenue. Tribal loyalties are now being tested to the west of Tripoli as Haftar's forces try to open a new front. In the chaos that this country has suffered since the revolution that overthrew Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, reconciliation between certain tribes was only possible because of the great effort of tribal leaders and civil society groups. The repeated failure of UN-sponsored ceasefire talks means fears are growing among many Libyans that tribal divisions are being exploited again. Charles Strafford, Al Jazeera, Tripoli.
Haftar, who used to be close to Gaddafi during his era and afterward fled to the USA where he was protected by the CIA and later returned to Libya again, laid siege to the legitimate government in the capital, Tripoli, which is recognized by the UN, in April 2019 before the very eyes of the whole world. The coup plotter Haftar forces had already seized control in a large part of the country and were called with death and destruction. Haftar's progress against the legitimate government was being supported by Russia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and France. The airplanes full of weapons and mercenaries were fueling Haftar's latest attack on the capital. The United Arab Emirates was sending mercenaries from many countries of Africa to Haftar for help. The troops of Wagner, which was a renowned Russian company that provided mercenaries to the conflict zones in the world, were also in Libya. As the fall of Tripoli was only a matter of time, a development that nobody expected and that would change all the balances in the region would put Haftar and his supporters in a difficult situation.
إنما إذا كان يعتقد البعض أنه يستطيع أن يتجاوز الخط سرت الجفرة، ده أمر بالنسبة لنا خط أحمر. لن يدافع عن ليبيا إلا أهل ليبيا، وإحنا مستعدين نساعد ونساند ده. هاتوا النهاردة من شباب القبائل من عندكم وتحت إشرافكم ندربهم ونجهزهم ونسلحهم تحت إشرافكم.
Understanding the origin and nature of recent and current Middle East conflicts is vital for those who follow the region and are interested in seeing it advance to the next level toward peace, stability, and prosperity. For the time being, let's just review what we know and what we learned about Middle East conflicts. We learned that dictatorship and stability go hand in hand, but never ends well. That foreign intervention never succeeds and only is self-serving. That tribalism and democracy do not mix. That authoritarianism and corruption are twin brothers. That populism is not the answer either, as it never delivers. That strange bedfellows may be created on the basis of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That likely the young generation is the only one that can save the Middle East, and that the Middle East is really complicated. So thank you for being attentive and for your interest in this lecture, and see you next week.
Before we go, I'd like to talk about the situation in the Middle East. I know it's not really that funny of a subject, but the place is in shambles. I think there needs to be some dialogue on it. And I just think that and I'm not just talking about Iraq. The entire Middle East. It's been in shambles for years and years. And Iraq, Iran, Palestine, Afghanistan, it just seems like that entire area has always had a presence of these crazy, pissed off people that run around blowing stuff up. And it's not going to stop until we get these guys some air conditioning. I truly believe that. I'm just thinking, if they didn't have to hang out in 120-degree temperatures all day, maybe God wouldn't talk to them as much. I'm not slamming the religion. I'm just saying, if you're a human being and you get that hot for that long, you're going to go crazy. It doesn't matter where you live, what your nationality is. Look at Texas. Yeehaw, jihad, there is very little difference in my opinion. They're all just trying to say, we hot!